You know, it's one of history's biggest mysteries, right? A real puzzle that's captivated people for literally centuries. We know all about the birth of Jesus and, of course, his public ministry as an adult, but what happened in between? So let's dive right into this fascinating gap in the record, the missing years of Jesus. And this leads to a pretty wild question, one you've maybe even heard before. Did a teenage Jesus really travel all the way to Asia to study as a Buddhist guru? I mean, it's a sensational idea for sure, and that's the central question we're going to unpack right now. So, where does a question like that even come from? Well, it all comes down to a kind of biblical conundrum. You see, the Gospels are almost completely silent about Jesus' life from the time he was 12 until he was 30. And that silence, that big gap in the story, has fueled all kinds of speculation for, well, nearly 2,000 years. Okay, so this timeline really lays out the problem, doesn't it? We get the birth stories, sure. Then there's that one single story in the Gospel of Luke about a 12-year-old Jesus visiting the temple in Jerusalem. And after that, nothing. Radio silence. We just jump a full 18 years, and boom, he's 30 years old and starting his public ministry. So the big question is, what on earth happened in that giant gap? Well, this is exactly where all the theories come rushing in to fill the void. And probably one of the most popular, most persistent ideas out there is that Jesus spent those formative years on a big spiritual journey, all the way to India. So where did this specific theory start? Well, the modern version of it traces back to 1894 and a Russian journalist named Nicholas Notovitch. And boy, did he make a spectacular claim. He said that while he was traveling in the Himalayas, he stumbled upon a hidden ancient manuscript inside a Tibetan monastery. This manuscript, he claimed, was called The Life of Saint Isa. Now, Isa is a name that's often associated with Jesus in parts of the East. And according to Notovitch, this ancient text laid out the whole story, a journey of a young man from Galilee who traveled to India, Nepal, and Tibet, just soaking up the teachings of Hinduism and Buddhism before he headed back home. Okay, an ancient text, a hidden monastery, a secret journey to the East. I mean, it's a fantastic story, right? Sounds like something out of a movie. But the real question is any of it true? All right, let's put on our investigator hats for a second and really fact-check these incredible claims. First off, let's just talk logistics. The distance from Galilee all the way to Nepal is roughly 5,000 kilometers. That's over 3,000 miles. Think about that for a second. For a teenager in the first century with no modern transportation, a journey of that magnitude would have been, well, next to impossible. It would have been an absolutely epic feat, making him one of the greatest travelers of the entire ancient world. And that brings us to the next huge problem. The teachings themselves just don't line up. I mean, the core message of Jesus, the one we find in all the earliest and most reliable sources, is fundamentally Jewish. It's all about loving God, loving your neighbor, and the coming kingdom of God. Now compare that to the central ideas of Buddhism, which teach that the self is an illusion and the goal is to get rid of all desire to reach nirvana. We're talking about two profoundly different worldviews here. They just don't mix. But honestly, here is the single biggest, most glaring hole in the entire story. It's the real deal breaker. Notovitch claimed Jesus studied Buddhism in Nepal. The problem with that? Well, Buddhism didn't even reach Nepal until the 7th century. That's a full 600 years after Jesus would have been alive. You can't study a religion that isn't there yet. And all of this really builds to a pretty definitive conclusion. You see, not long after Notovitch published his book, investigators actually looked into his claims, and guess what they found? The head of the very monastery he said he visited went on the record and said, nope, no Russian has ever been here, and he was very clear, no text about a Saint Isa has ever existed in their archives. Historians who looked at the story pretty quickly declared it a complete fabrication, a hoax.
So the final verdict is pretty clear, isn't it? The whole theory that Jesus traveled to India during his missing years isn't based on some incredible ancient discovery. It's based on what has been thoroughly, and I mean thoroughly, debunked as a 19th century hoax.
But you know, this desire to fill in the gaps, it's not just a modern thing. Long before our friend Notovitch came along, way back in the centuries after the New Testament was written, other people tried to imagine what a young Jesus was like. And they wrote these stories, which we now call the infancy gospels. And let me tell you, these stories were, well, they were sensational. We're talking about a child Jesus with these incredible, uncontrollable powers, turning clay birds he made into real, living birds, getting so angry he strikes other kids dead and then brings them back to life, and of course, constantly correcting his totally baffled school teachers. I mean, they're just wild, fanciful tales. Okay, now let's contrast those crazy stories with this quote from the Gospel of Matthew. When the adult Jesus starts teaching in his own hometown, the people who knew him his whole life are completely shocked. They're like, wait a minute, isn't this the carpenter's son? We know his family. Where did this guy get all this wisdom? Now think about it. Their shock makes absolutely no sense if he'd been running around turning birds to life and resurrecting his playmates his whole childhood. It really suggests he had a pretty normal, quiet upbringing. Which brings us right back to our central question. If all these sensational theories are wrong, then why are the Gospels silent? Well, the real reason has nothing to do with a secret journey or some hidden conspiracy. It has everything to do with how people wrote biographies back then. Here's the key thing we have to get our heads around. Ancient biographies were just not like modern ones. Not at all. Today, we expect a book to cover someone's life from cradle to grave, right? Every little detail. But ancient writers? They had a completely different goal in mind. See, for an ancient biographer, the main goal was to answer one big question. Who is this person and why are they important? So they focused almost exclusively on the person's public life, their big acts, their major accomplishments. Childhood details? They only made the cut if they directly set the stage for who the person would become as an adult. That's why we get the birth stories and that one incident in the temple. They were seen as important foreshadowing. So when you look at it that way, the silence isn't some deep mystery we need to solve. It's actually a feature of that style of writing. For the gospel writers, the details of Jesus working as a carpenter in Nazareth for 18 years, well, they just didn't really contribute to the main story they wanted to tell. And that story was all about his public ministry, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection. So that leaves us with one final thought. I want you to think about this. What's actually more compelling? Is it the sensational story about a secret journey to the East, a story that we know is based on a 19th century hoax? Or is it the simple, historically plausible reality of a carpenter's son from a small town whose early life was so ordinary that when his world-changing public ministry began, it left the very people who knew him best in a state of total and utter shock?